Hi everyone, and welcome back to another tutorial. Today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to configure HA using Firewall Defense Device Manager FDM to configure to FTDv version 7.3.0 running on KVM in Ubuntu 22.04. So let's take a quick look at how the setup will look like. Okay, so I have configured in my lab environment, right, IP table acting as a two-tier firewall, and then behind the IP tables I have two FTD that I have done the initial configuration wizard setup, right, and I will use this two FTDv to show you how to configure HA, right. The IP address is pretty much exactly the same that you see on this diagram, so you can refer back to the diagram for the configuration as we go along. So the first thing we're going to do is to configure the primary FTDv, right, the primary device or the active device, followed by the secondary FTDv, right, the secondary device or the standby device, and then we'll go ahead and configure the failover and the failover stateful link. Now you can configure the failover link as well as the stateful failover link as two separate interface in two separate network, right? But for this tutorial, we're going to use the same failover link interface and network for the stateful failover link. So we don't need to configure two separate set of IP address and use two different interface and two virtual switch, right? For depending on your setup, if it's a small setup, this is sufficient, right? As failover, make sure that if the active device or the interfaces on the active device fail, the secondary or the standby device will kick in, right? And the stateful or the stateful failover link is to help you maintain, right, the state so that most of the application doesn't get impacted while the failover happens. After that, we're going to use the Windows client behind the firewall, right, or behind the FTDv to simulate or to show you that the impact of the failover or the HA is minimum, right? So the traffic shouldn't be impacted, the operation should continue even when the failover happens. So we will do a no failover active on the active device to simulate the machine going offline, right, or do a force HA or activate a force HA so that the standby unit takes over. Okay, so we'll go over to my Windows LAN client now to start configuring the setup that you see here. Okay, so let's do a quick check. This is my Windows LAN client 172.16.2.111. Right, so let's start by launching the FTD or the FDM. Right, 172.16.2.45 is the management IP of the primary or the active unit. Okay, so let's key in the username and password. You would have changed the password if you've gone through the setup wizard. Okay, so once you complete the setup wizard, you will have the static route net or the basic configuration done. What you want to do is that unless you're using the same subnet as the default subnet, which is 192.168.45.1, the first thing that I'll recommend you to do is to change the LAN IP, right, to suit what is in your environment. So in my environment, 172.16.2 is the subnet for my internal LAN. .2 is the gateway IP address that I have set. Okay, remember to change the DHCP scope if you have one. 2.230. I'm going to set a slightly smaller DHCP scope, okay, for this tutorial. And then once it's done, click on OK. And then click on deploy now. Right, so that should change the subnet of your internal LAN. Okay, while it is happening, we can go back to device. So to configure HA, just come over to device, click on device, and then under next to high availability, click on configure. Right. Okay, the wizard is very user friendly, right? Intuitive. So you ask you what is the role for this device. Now, if you want to look at a little bit of the explanation, a summary of how it works, you can actually look at or read the explanation here as well, right? So we're going to start with the configuration. So first, select primary device. So the first step that we're going to do is to configure the failover link, right? So we're going to configure the failover link. So let's start. For the interface, make sure that you are selecting the same interface, right? So for FTDv, you must make sure that you have the exact same number of network port, as well as the same version, right? For physical device, same, right? It has to be the same device that you're going to configure HA port for. Right. So for virtual device, there's no PoE, so I'm going to use the last port. But for physical device like 1010 or 1010E, you actually have the power over Ethernet on the last two port, right? So you might not want to use that. You might want to use another port. Sorry, accidentally click back. Okay, so let's go in and select the last virtual interface, which is gigabit Ethernet 0/7. I'm going to give it an IP address. It's in my subnet 172.16.7.2, right? It's my primary IP that I'm going to assign for the failover link, failover interface. 7.3 is the standby or the secondary IP address. Using Class C network, you can use a smaller network or a larger network depending on your setup. Okay, you can configure IPsec encryption key, right, to keep the communication secure. For trial environment, you will not really be able to use this feature because for trial environment, or if you're using trial license, triple dash is not enabled, right? So you need at least triple dash for recommended encryption standard, right? But I'm going to show you how it looks like if you have a triple dash license set up. So we're going to key in the IPsec encryption key. Make sure you remember this key because it is also used, or you need to configure this or key in this in the secondary IP device. Okay, so that is very much what you need to configure for the failover link. Next, for the stateful failover link, right? If you have a separate network or you are using a separate interface, you need to manually configure this. But since we are using the same interface, we just need to select this, use the same interface as the failover link. It will automatically use the same interface and IP address as the failover link itself. Okay, so once you're done, click on activate HA. Now in a lab environment, test environment, you can do it anytime, right? But if you're doing it in the production, there is some downtime. So do schedule your downtime if you are doing this for production. So let's activate HA. It takes about a couple of minutes to get this deployed. So I'm going to pause the video and come back after the deployment is done. The deployment is done. So unlike the rest of the configuration whereby you need to manually deploy the configuration when you are configuring the HA, it automatically deploy the configuration after you activate the HA. Right, so there's a little wizard here to prompt you the next step. So we need to configure the peer device. So it says copy the HA configuration to clipboard. So you can click here to copy. You have to select and then do a copy or Control C, close the configuration, click on got it. Right, so we've done configuring the basic setup for the primary device. Let's click on active. You should see that it's trying to negotiate with the secondary device. So now let's hop over to the secondary device, right? 6.2.46 is what I've given to the secondary device. Do make sure that you set a device management IP for the primary and secondary device. Oops, do remember to specify HTTPS. Okay, and then key in the username and password that you have changed, especially the password. So once you have gone through the configuration wizard, you will see that the configuration is similar. The only difference is I've configured a separate IP address. Now, if you are doing this on a physical device, recommendation is not to plug in your LAN cable because the IP address is the same, right? So it might cause conflict if you connect the physical device. For lab environments, pretty much okay because I'm using a separate network, so it doesn't really matters. Okay, so the configuration is very much the same. Right, you go to device, you come over to high availability and click on configure. Okay, now instead of selecting primary device, you want to select the secondary device now. Okay, you can manually configure the configuration like what we've done with the primary device, or you can just click paste from clipboard and paste the configuration. Right, you can see that IP address is set up for you for the primary and the secondary IP. Click on OK. You can see that it automatically populates the interface and the IP address to the secondary device. For me, I like to make sure I click same, use the same interface as a failover link. Therefore, I avoid mistakes if I've accidentally changed any of this. Right, so like I mentioned earlier, you will need to key in the IPsec encryption key, right? So it's important that it's consistent. If not, the HA setup will fail, right? So make sure you remember the password properly. You must make sure that the encryption standard and the license is consistent. We'll not really be using the encryption standard because TripleDesk is not enabled, but it will still work, right, when we activate this. So now let's activate HA. So that's all you need to do, right? It's very, very easy to configure HA for the FTDv devices, whether you're using FDM or FMC, right? So that's one of the cool thing about the new firewall threat defense solution. Activate HA, it take a while. We'll pause the video and come back when it is done. Okay, the configuration is done, right, on the secondary device. Now click on I configure both devices. It'll tell you that configuration complete. Congratulations, got it, right? So now if I go over to the device, I would see that the peer, right, is active, right? This is my secondary device, and you will see that this device is part of HA, is currently in standby state. You can't really change the configuration, so do remember when it's in HA configuration, the configuration should always be done on the primary device, whether it's your net policy, access policy, interface changes. It should always be done by the in active device, and then it will propagate over to the secondary device. There are a few configurations like management IP address, accounts, or password for management, things that you can configure on the standby unit itself, right? So look at the document for what are the things you can configure, right, on a HA standby devices, right, and what you should be configuring on the active device itself. Now, if you look at this, you will see that there is a orange, bidirectional circle signifying it is synchronizing. Now, if we go back to the primary device, you will see similarly that this is a active unit. The primary device is active and the peer is syncing, right? So it takes a while for the synchronization to work. When it finishes, you will see that this icon here changes color as well, and then it will show you that the peer is on standby. It takes a while. We will let the sync complete and then come back to go to the next step, which is to configure the standby IP and the virtual MAC address, right? It's not a mandatory step, but it is a recommended step because it helps with when it fails over the up table information, right? Having virtual MAC address helps in some of the layer 2 up requests. Okay, so let's pause the video, and you can see right now is almost done, right? You can see that the peer has changed to standby. It is still synchronizing the config. When it's done, this will become a gray color bidirectional arrow. Okay, so I think we're good for now. So we'll let the rest of the synchronization done, and you can see that you can't really do any configuration when the configuration is being pushed from the primary device to the secondary device. Okay, it's fine. So the next step that we're going to do, right, after configuring the HA link, we're going to do a few other optional touch-up, right? So if you don't need all these things, you have effectively done your configuration. You can do the tests that I'm going to show you later. But I'm going to show you what I would like to do normally, right? So if you go back to the inside interface of the active or primary device, you will see that the standby IP address is not configured, right? So this is the IP address that is used for monitoring. If you have an IP address, you'll monitor not only the state of the interface, but you will also check the IP address as well, right? So we're going to do that, give it a standby IP address, and then click on advanced, and then you can do enable HA monitoring on the device, right? So what it does is that we'll look at the failover policy later. It's slightly different from my blog. We look at the failover policy before we configure the standby IP address, but for the video I want to show you the MAC address configuration, right? So there's a list of privately used MAC address that is usually used that has the lowest risk of MAC address config, right? You can check out the INA MAC address allocation. So I believe 0E is XE is usually used for private IP MAC address. So we're going to use the 00.0.2.002, right? So of course you must make sure that if you are using internal MAC address or virtual MAC address for other devices, make sure they do not conflict, right? So 0E 00.0.0.2003 for the internal interface standby MAC address. Okay, once you are done, just click on OK. So you can see that I'm configuring all the primary and the standby stuff on the active or the primary FTD, right? Because the configuration, once it's deployed, will be pushed to the secondary device. Okay, so we've done that for the inside interface. You can also do this for the outside interface, which is the 1.3 that we have previously assigned, right? Likewise, going over to advanced, we're going to set up the virtual MAC address. Follow your company naming convention and what you use. 3, right? So now, if you do not want to, monitor the interface for HA purpose, you can always uncheck the enable for HA monitoring. Okay, done. Okay, once you are done, right, you'll see that you will have a standby IP address configured for the inside and the outside interface. Okay, so unlike the HA deployment, you will need to deploy this config. Okay, go over and click on. You can review the changes, which is great, right? You can look at deployment history. I think that's some of the great stuff that the new Cisco Secure Firewall brings to the table, right? It allows you to minimize, errors, conflicts, right, before you deploy. So IP address, we've added standby. IP address, we have added the MAC address, the virtual MAC address for the primary and the standby device that we can deploy now. Okay, so you can always monitor the deployment as it goes. So we're going to pause the video, takes a bit of time, and then come back when the deployment is done. Okay, the deployment has completed. So let's click on OK. Now if we click on the device icon again, we can see that right now the synchronization or the importing is happening, right? So configuration is being imported to the peer standby device. So we want to let this deployment complete, but while it is doing its deployment, let's go in and take a look at what are the options you can configure for failover criteria, right? So you can do a quick review of your configuration. Tells you what is the software. We are doing 7.3.0-69. The database, right, for all the rules and geolocation and whatnot is running database 358, and then the snort IPS rule is updated to the respective version. We can see that the interface we are using for the failover link, the primary and the secondary IP address, and then stateful failover link is using the same failover IP, and we have configured IPsec encryption key. Okay, so that's pretty much what we've done. Now what we look at is that the failover criteria. Okay, so there are mainly, right, two failover criteria, right? So of course the first one is the interface, right? So if you remember, we have configured to monitor the outside and the inside interface, right? So if any of the interface fail, right? So the number of interface exceeding 1, and you can monitor up to 211 interfaces. Definitely not for small setup, right? But for this setup, we just need to make sure that if one of the interface goes down, the failover will or the HA will kick in, right? So that's on the interface side of things. Next, let's take a look at the interface timing configuration, right? Default, I believe we are polling every 5000 milliseconds. So you want to increase this and or decrease this depending on the environment, right? If you have a very heavy network, which may cause polling to be delayed, right? You might want to increase the polling time, and then the whole time basically will send another poll, right? I believe it's up to 3 times, right? If the polling yields a negative results, right? So if I'm polling the interface uh, after 5,000 milliseconds, and if it fails, I'll wait for uh, 3 times that time and then poll again. And then if it fails again, then once it hits the criteria, you can look at the explanation here. Once it passed the hold time and poll time, right? That's where the HA will kick in, right? So that's for the interface monitoring, and then you have the device monitoring as well, right? So likewise, you will poll the status of the uh, device. So the standby peer, will poll whether the active device is alive, is up and running. If it's not, after a certain amount of polling, right, 1000 milliseconds, and then 3 tries within a 15,000 millisecond time frame, the HA will kick in, right? So that will minimize the downtime, right, and automate the process of failover in case, right, one of the unit goes down. Okay, so that's pretty much the failover criteria, right? And you can configure the criteria here based on your environment and your needs. Okay, so now let's go back to the device. I should see that, like I mentioned, right? You can see that now it is active for the parent device, and then the peer is on standby. And like I mentioned, right, the icon here has become a gray bidirectional arrow. So once that is done, you know that the HA is set up properly. The configuration has been pushed to the standby unit successfully. Okay, now we can go to the last step of our tutorial, which is to simulate the HA, right? So what we're gonna do is to let me launch a FileZilla, right? This allows me to show you much better, right? With a UI, I can do it in the command, but UI is much easier. So let's go to the mirror side. Okay, let me just bring this down, and then let's go to let's try and get a larger files. FTP mirror public site cases. Let's download a Debian, right? Okay, let's process a queue, right? I'll terminate it as you can see. It's downloading. So what we're gonna do is to head over to the command prompt of the active unit. You can see that encryption key is not enabled because it's trial. So if you have a actual license key, you shouldn't see that error. Okay, so once we're in, we can do a simulation to do a no failover active, right? So when we do this command, what it does is it change the active units to standby, right? To simulate that this guy has or the active unit has gone down. Then let's head back to the client. Okay, so you can see that the connection download is still going on, but if we head over to the FTD now, you will see that now the primary device has become standby and the peer has become active. And if we head over here and do a refresh, Okay, because we are using self-signed cert, so you always get this prompt unless you trust the cert. Right, and if you go in there, you can see that now the secondary device has become active and then the peer has become standby. Right, and if we go back to the FTP, you can see that the FTP session is still going on without any interruption. Right, so that's how easy it is to set up HA, right, for your lab environment if you are like me doing testing, right, with FTDv. And it's also very easy to set this up in your production environment, right? So I believe compared to the way ASA configuration is with ADSM, the FTD using FDM or even cloud-based FMC has really make it a lot easier, right, for network administrator to configure or security team to configure their firewalls and to manage the firewall. So for small setup, FDM is definitely sufficient if you're just 1 or 2 units, right, without needing for central management, central logging and stuff. But if you have a slightly larger environment, whether you have a firewall on-prem or in the cloud, the cloud-based FMC is definitely a good option for you to manage your firewalls in your production environment. Okay, so let me just terminate this so that I don't choke up the bandwidth of the free mirror site. Right, apologies for doing spam download, right? But just to give you a quick view of a demo, right? Okay, so that's pretty much what I have in terms of configuration. You can do some high-level troubleshooting, right? So you can go over to the failover history, right? And you will launch a command line that shows you the task, right? Or the log of the task that happens for the failover configuration, right? And then you can always look at deployment history, just look at what was being triggered and deployed successfully, right? And if you notice now that even though I'm on 172.16.2.46, right, my host name has changed, right, to FTDv-3-0-active, right? So don't get confused by this. It's just a way of naming for me in my lab environment, but the actual change, or whether you're using the primary or secondary unit, happens on the device itself. Okay. With that, I've come to the end of my tutorial, right? Hope the tutorial has been useful, and stay tuned for the next video. I'm probably going to do a configuration of the site-to-site VPN and the remote access VPN in my future video. Thank you, take care, and stay safe.